So now I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker. So Julia Ryeland completed her PhD on male reproductive success in emus back in 2020 and has since then been helping governmental bodies to determine the best practice management of emus across the east coast of Australia, where, as some of you may know, they are actually known to be disappearing. She has a broad interest in behavioural research to conservation and managing problems. So Julia wants to understand behavioural adaptations in the wetland context, and more recently, she's helping manage the emus in the urbanised areas. Julia, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I wanted to talk a little bit today to give everyone a bit more information about emus or what we know. So I've got a little slideshow if you don't mind me sharing it. Oh, I think it's disabled the screen sharing for participants.
We will make you co-host and then you can share your screen.
You should be able to. I just changed that.
Oh, perfect, thank you. Okay. Let me know if you can see it all okay.
Yes, we can
Good?
see you. Yes.
Okay. So obviously emus are a pretty iconic species here in Australia. They occur on our coat of arms with the kangaroo, and they've also have a lot of importance to a lot of Indigenous cultures. They have different meanings in different cultures, but often they would use the eggs as sources of food, and they would use the constellations. They believe that there was the emu in the sky and that they could see what stage the emu was at, whether it had chicks or it had eggs, and know when that they could harvest the eggs. And then more recently, it's been used in a farming context, less so in Australia, funnily enough, than other countries, but they're often used for emu oil predominantly, and some other things like feathers and meats, but less commonly. So you can see this little graph here down the bottom, and it's really not much known about emus, particularly in the wild. They're quite a hard animal to study. And so most of our knowledge comes from captive populations rather than in the wild, which makes it a bit difficult to sort of really understand their natural behaviours. They're part of this bigger group called the ratites, which includes all of these large flightless birds, such as the ostriches, the cassowaries, the tinamou, the rheas, and they're most closely related to the cassowaries, which are also here in Australia. And they split about 35 million years ago. But before now, there was other species of emus. We only have the one now. More recently, we had a smaller version of the emu, which occurred in some of these islands right down south in Australia off the coastline on Kangaroo Island and King Island. But they became extinct over 100 years ago, mostly through hunting, we believe. But prior to that, there was also some other prehistoric emus that occurred and some precursors to the emus. But today we just have the singular emu species around Australia. And it occurs across pretty much the whole continent, which is pretty incredible. They don't occur in this far north region, which is quite arid and then quite tropical in some regions, but all across the south they occur. And this is some of my just recently published work, which we looked at how their distribution has changed across the past 6,000 years and how it's likely to change in the future. And you can see that they actually occurred further north along the east coast, and they've moved northwards along the central parts of Australia. And you can see this again here. This is just showing where there's been losses of emus. So there's been a big expansion throughout the centre of Australia, but there's been a loss of emus along the east coast. And the reason why they're able to occur across so many different environments, this, obviously Australia is an enormous continent. We have lots of the arid regions, we have woodlands, we have rainforest, coastal regions, obviously. And they're such generalists that they can use resources from all of these different environments. They can eat almost any different, all types of food sources. They're herbivorous. They're also quite well insulated with all of their feathers. They don't have a barbed feather because they're not flightless, because they are flightless. So they don't need to have these flight feathers. And they have a lot of feathers, obviously, so they're quite well insulated. And because they occur in so many different habitats, they have quite different movement patterns across these different habitats. So in the west of Australia, where it's quite arid in the inland, they make these enormous movements from north to south following rainfall patterns. And this is thought to sort of trigger the reproduction as the rain starts to come and it becomes winter time. We have some fences across Australia near agricultural lands that to prevent pests crossing into agricultural lands. And you can see, the emus have moved southwards and gotten caught on this fence, and there's, hundreds of thousands of birds all moving together. On the east coast, it's a little bit different. Right on the east coast, resources for the emus are a little bit more stable. And so they're known more to be residents, and so they'll stay in the same area for long periods of time. But they're known to be able to move quite easily. They can travel, 50 kilometers an hour, and they've, from some tracking data in the 60s, they found that they traveled up to 500 kilometers in a year, so enormous movements. But as I said, across the East Coast, even though they do have quite stable resources, they're becoming restricted. And for those who know Australia at all, most of our population live along the East Coast, so that's where it's really becoming urbanised. And so this was some work I did with some researchers from Macquarie University here in Sydney, and we looked at how emu populations are genetically structured, because they do move so frequently between what, a loosely population. They're not really a population. They're sort of easily moving without. And this graph's a little tricky to understand, but essentially what it's showing is that we have all of the inland emus clustering together. So they're not there's no distinct populations across the whole of the east of Australia. But on the east coast, we have this now actually listed as an endangered population. And that's actually a genetically distinct population. So we've got this sort of special population up on the north coast of New South Wales in the east of Australia, where there's this genetically distinct population that's receiving quite a bit of attention now. And so, as I said, part of the reason why they can move such large distances and occur across, most of Australia is because they have such a generalist diet. They'll more or less eat anything that they can get their beaks on. And they're kind of considered to be this apostatic diet, which means that they really focus on a given resource, and then once that's just depleted, once that's gone, they'll move on. And because of this, they are one of the species thought to be responsible for really large quantities of seeds being dispersed across different plant communities. And they're thought to be able to move genetics of plant communities between one another, where they would have been isolated otherwise. These fragmented East Coast plant populations have now the emus that move the seeds between them. But one thing they are restricted by is they don't have particularly great water conservation. So they're thought to be restricted to areas where there are permanent water sources. And when you do have large droughts, which we often have in Australia, you end up getting quite large mortality of emus in some of these sort of arid regions. So I'm not sure what you've observed of your emus there, but mostly they aren't known to be gregarious or social. So they don't occur in social groups with any sort of social structure or hierarchy. They will occur in large groups, but this is mostly around clustered resources. So, where you have a permanent body of water, you'll often see emus gathering just before sunrise, sunset to get that water. But Other than that, we are not known to have any kind of group structure, except for during the mating season when they start to fight for mates. They're also non-territorial. So I think partly this is just my hypothesis, but because they are such generalists, there's not really any point in fighting for resources, fighting for, you know, clump food sources. So they quite easily share a home range with one another. And this is some tracking work that I did a few years ago in sort of one of our relatively urban parks where, you know, you can see all these different polygon colors and they're all overlapping. So they'll move quite easily, you know, within each other's territories or home ranges. And generally the only time you see them be really aggressive to one another is when it's mating season and they're fighting for access to mates. The emu isn't known to have a lot of predators as an adult. The chicks have lots of predators, and that's when they're really vulnerable. Once they become adults, they actually have quite low mortality rates from what we know. And historically, they would have been, you know, birds of prey on the chicks and eggs, monitors, things like big goannas, big sort of lizards that we have here, and then more recently dingoes. But we have a lot of pest animals in Australia, and so, you know, the thought is that that is one of the key reasons why they're disappearing across the East Coast. You know, you've got, this is a picture I took of a nest where the male's just been flushed off, and you've got a little fox here, and foxes are known to take eggs. We also have pigs, which are known to destroy eggs, and so does other feral animals. But some of the other reasons we think they might be declining across the East Coast is this increasing urbanisation, which, as I said, is really dominant across the East Coast. And killing in agricultural land, which still happens in some areas, particularly during drought when emus can take up, you know, huge amounts of grain that are put out for livestock. And then other kind of urbanised issues such as road mortality or entanglement in fences. But, you know, there's no data on this, it's just all anecdotal. And, you know, this is what we sort of have, people who are working with emus in parks and government have noticed that these are the main issues. And this was a report that was done sort of almost 20 years ago now, but they looked at cells in it, like spaces across Australia where emus were recorded 20 years ago to the present at this time of the report. And it's a bit of a tricky one because I had to scan it out of a book, but essentially you can see all of these sort of greyed areas with the hatch across it are all areas where they've actually been noticed to decline. So they've seen in less places than they were the 20 years before. So it's not just right on the East Coast. It looks like it's a more widely seen issue. So this is my research topic and something that I find really fascinating about emus. Most birds, as some people will know, are monogamous, and the female does most of the parental care. So they'll stay in a partner for most of their life, or, you know, at least a few years, and the female will then look after the chicks and help raise with, you know, often with some help from the male. But what's really interesting in the emus is they've kind of got it reversed, which is actually a really small number of birds that have this system. So the females mate with multiple males, and she'll defend and fight for those access to those mates, and then she'll lay across multiple nests, which leads to really mixed paternity nests, and sometimes eggs in that male's nest that aren't related to him or the female that he has mated with. And this is just a little, it's quite hard to tell males and females apart. The males are slightly smaller, but often by eye, that's pretty tricky to see. The main difference is their calls. And so you probably would have heard this at the zoo, and hopefully this will work. Give me a thumbs up if it has. This is the male. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but we'll push on anyway. And this is the female. And so the female
No, we can't hear them, but we do hear we do hear them sort of gurgling in their throats to us at the zoo.
Yeah, so the males have quite a grunty sound. It's quite a short little grunts, and maybe we can pop some in post-production. But the females have this sort of deep boom sound. And the thought is, though again, there's no information, no research on it, is that this really deep drumming sound that the females make is to broadcast that they're there and it's hopefully to travel really long distances. It's a low frequency, so it can travel through forest and hopefully reach other males, so she can let them know that she's there. So for the female, her main job is to find and then defend the best males. So that's where she puts most of her energy into. And they, have this system called a polyandrous system, which just means that she's mating with lots of different males. But then they lay quite a few number of eggs. So there's nothing known in the wild, but in captivity, they can lay sort of 20 odd eggs a year. And they'll lay them across multiple different nests, which means that clutch sizes, the number of eggs that a male looks after, can really range. This was from, it said 28 when I looked in the literature, but from my experience, I've had nests up to 35 eggs where the male can barely sort of fit them underneath him. But unfortunately, most of the information we have is from farmed birds. Then for the male, he has a really big job. So he also mates with multiple females, and then he's left to look after this big clutch by himself. So once the female's mated and laid her eggs, she's off, she's gone elsewhere. And he sits on that nest for up to two months, so 56 to 60 days. This might not look like much, this picture up in the corner, but this is actually an emu nest. So they just lay on the ground. The male will start to cover the nest and put grass underneath the eggs. And then this is just the simple nest that he'll then sit on for that 2 months. And they do that in Australia's winter. So it gets pretty cold in some of the inland areas of Australia. Can get to below zero quite easily, which I know for Canada is not probably very cold, but for here, that's pretty cold when you're sitting on the ground for 2 months, more or less not moving. And then once those chicks hatch, they'll often stay with him for a year to 2 years, around 18 months usually. So I wanted to just, talk a little bit about my research. Just obviously that's where I, what I'm really excited about. And I looked at a little bit more at their mating system, because it is so different than so many other birds, and it's such an interesting system to look at. And particularly for the males who look after these, potentially really genetically mixed clutches where only some might be his own young. And he invests a lot. He loses half his body weight during incubation. He barely gets up to feed or to drink. And so it's a huge investment for him. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about what really drives this investment. What makes him make the decisions he makes when he's sitting on that nest for that 2 months and losing most of his body weight, potentially meaning that he can only incubate every second year. And so unfortunately, again, I had to do this on a farm. It's very, you would be surprised that it's hard to find emu nests. I know that they're an enormous bird and their eggs are enormous and they're this bright green color, but you might be able to see down on the bottom there, I've got a camera on a nest, and he's pretty hard to see when you're searching almost anywhere for him. So I did this on a farm, and I looked at the behavior over the 2 months of nesting, using these remote cameras to then record the behavior of day and night. So I got some pretty interesting photos. This one here is down the bottom in the middle is a female laying. So that strange posture, she's looks pretty uncomfortable. But yeah, that was quite a cool thing to be able to see that how they look when they're laying. And then obviously up the top, we've got two here fighting. So the first thing I looked at was what makes a really good emu egg. I know this might sound a little silly, but there's so much research on egg color. And so I wanted to understand a little bit about egg color and egg size in the emu, because it is such a different and unusual looking egg. And so they have this quite a lot of variation in their egg color. And what I found was that these really dark green, dull green colored eggs are actually much more likely to hatch and then to have successful young than the really bright colored eggs. And what we think it might be is that during the really cold winters, the males do get off the nest occasionally, and then those eggs are likely to cool too much and the embryos might die. So by having this really dark egg, it's like a dark car, you know, it absorbs heat. And so that might help them survive while the male's off the nest. And then what else I also found was that what's really good for an offspring, so the offsprings, these really large, heavy eggs is really good, but the males just, they don't really, what they really need to be successful is to have lots and lots of eggs. So yeah, I looked at the different sort of selection on shape and color of the eggs and to see what was good for the males. And so they just like lots of little eggs, which means that if a male gets lots and lots of little eggs, that they're going to be more successful as a dad. And so, yeah, as I just said, this might be a thermoregulation thing. Having these really dark coloured eggs means that they're more likely to hatch and the male is more likely to have lots of young. So clutch size is a really interesting thing in the emu because they have lots of females laying in their nests. They can have these really enormous clutch sizes. So here I had, you know, clutches. Before I messed around with them, they were from anywhere from 4 eggs to 32 eggs. And what I found was that there was different in the number that would hatch with these different clutch sizes. So what I did was, went ahead and manipulated them to make them 4 eggs, 11 eggs, or 20 eggs to sort of understand what this clutch size means for the male. So males that have these really large clutches spend a lot of time on the nest, and actually less and less of them will hatch until the point when they have these really, really large sort of 32 egg clutches and barely any of them hatch. So what they really want is to have these medium-sized sort of eggs. And so there might be a bit of selection going on there for the male to protect his clutch against having too many eggs. So females might all want to lay in the same nest of a really good quality male, but he doesn't, you know, he really needs to keep that clutch size down so that he can hatch as many eggs as he possibly can. Because they do spend an enormous time on the nest. So I found that they actually spent 74% of the time hanging around the nest. That's sitting on the eggs and rotating the eggs, putting some grass material over the eggs. And this is really high during sort of about 8 to 15 days after the eggs have been laid. And so this is the peak of when those embryos are growing, and the male is almost on the nest 100% of the time during that period. And for most of that time while he's hanging around the nest, he's actually just sitting there. He's completely still almost 90% of the time. So that's an enormous investment that he's spending on that nest over those 2 months. And you can see that the more time, the larger the clutches, the more time he has to spend on. So when you have quite small clutches, he's spending much less, like almost 50% of the time. And then when he gets to these really large clutches, he has to spend his entire time on the nest to make sure any of them hatch. And so, yeah, there's a drive away from having these enormous nests, but they do occur. And obviously that means that the male's unable to stop females keeping on laying in these nests, and they become larger and larger. And the final thing that I looked at was understanding a little bit about what the male's paternity means to him in the nest. So whether he has any idea about which eggs have been laid by which females and whether they might be his own. And so some previous papers looked at paternity in the nest and found that almost 50% of the eggs weren't his own. So he was looking after 50% of other emus' chicks. And so that's a big investment to spend on, you know, children that aren't your own, essentially. And so what I wanted to understand was, does he, allocate different amounts of energy if he has more or less of his own chicks within the nest. And what I found was that the more eggs in that nest that were related to himself, the more time that he actually spent on the nest and the more investment he put in the nest. So he must have some idea there of, you know, how many of the eggs that are being laid that he's fertilized, and then increase the investment. But one also quite cool thing was when you have these really genetically mixed nests, what it means is actually you get more eggs hatching. So there must be some sort of benefit there from him letting females that he hasn't mated with lay in his nest. And it might looks like it increases the hatching success, but it might also increase the chance of those chicks surviving once they've hatched. And yeah, so just a little recap. So these males will invest more heavily when they have more of their own young, but it looks like there's some benefit for them in having a bit of genetic mixture in the nest. And when you have all these chicks, you have lots and lots of chicks that hatch, then you're more likely to have some that, you know, survive to adulthood that are your own. And just a little final, I thought was a pretty cool little finding was that, you know, it's always been, for a long time has been known that the males look after the nest and the chicks by themselves. But funnily enough, when they're at high densities, such as they are on farms, or relatively high densities, you actually often have an occurrence of 2 males, or even sometimes 3 males sitting on the nest. So you can see these 3 little bums they're all sitting together on the nest. And when I checked the sex of these birds through DNA, they were all males, and they were all unrelated males. So maybe this clutch is sort of divided amongst whose paternity it is, and so they've decided to all incubate that nest together. So it was a bit of a unique finding. And again, we don't have much knowledge about what happens once these little chicks hatch, but what we do know is that they are precocial, which means that the male doesn't feed them or, you know, look after them in that way like other sort of songbirds and things like that. But he might protect them. They stay with him for 18 months while they're quite small and quite vulnerable. And he probably protects them for things like foxes and birds of prey. So here we have a Wedgetail Eagle that's actually trying to get through the egg, but they would definitely take young as well. And that's all I have for you today. And I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about emus, of the sort of the things that we do know about them. There's a lot more to learn. And unfortunately, there's not enough people working on them in Australia, but yeah, we're piecing together the bits.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much.
No.
Julia, that was great. I knew a little bit about emus, and I knew that the males spend a lot of time, but I didn't quite realize. I loved the pictures you got from the camera on the actual nest. That was brilliant. And also the 3 males all sharing the duties. I think that's wonderful. Could we just stop sharing screen for a moment? That would be brilliant. I actually wanted to show you, let me start my camera. Oh, there we go. Anna, can you let me start my camera if you could?
I can try. I can.
All right. I have a picture now to show you. If I can just get my camera back. You will in 1 second. We also have eggs laid at the zoo, but because their breeding season tends to be in the winter months, we can't leave our male emu sitting on the eggs in, you know, minus whatever. So we do have some eggs, but we are unable to actually allow them to go to be bred, if that makes sense, to actually have emus. But no, that was amazing, and we thank you so much for talking to us, coming from Australia. And you said you're from Sydney, is that correct?
Yeah, from Sydney. Yep.
Excellent. I actually have a girlfriend in Sydney who we have trouble communicating because of a time difference.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one.
It is.
Yeah,
Well,
I could imagine those poor emus. The males would definitely try to incubate during the middle of minus 30 degrees. They're pretty persistent once they're started.
yes, they are. Well, I want to thank you again, Julia, for agreeing to do this recording with us. We really appreciate it. I wish the time difference wasn't quite so much. We would love to have had you live, but this will be going in with our Zooviews. We will be showing it to everyone. And for anyone who has missed our Zooviews, you can watch them on Friends of Hyde Park Zoo YouTube channel. We post them a few days after we've recorded them. And to find out when our next Zoo View is, please follow us on social media or check our website, and you will see the schedule of when the next Zoo Views are. So yeah, just behind me, these are some of the eggs the zookeepers gathered last year from our emus, and most of them are the dark green, which is interesting. And they're not massive. Well, I don't know. I don't think they're massive. They can sort of sit in my hand. We use them for educational reasons, and the ones we don't need, we actually let people have, and they paint them. They love to do beautiful, they have to blow them out obviously first, and then they paint them. So
yeah,
we don't let them go to waste, let's put it that way. They are well used.
That's great.
So once again, thank you, Julia. We really appreciate this. Anna, did you have something to add?
I'm going to stay on and see if I can now get my video to play. So,
okay, so you want us to hold on and see what happens?
If you want, I think what happens is I need to share screen.
Okay, so we're going to sign out technically, and we'll see if the video start. I think you got it. There is one of our eggs being held by one of the zookeepers. It's by Sandy, and there's Sunny and Bindi. They do love to have showers and mud baths, and it's always advisable to move back when they finished having their shower, because when they shake, they have held a lot of mud and moisture within their feathers.
Yeah, I could imagine. But yes, they do love water, and they're actually quite good swimmers. You wouldn't pick it, but I've seen them swimming across little creeks and things like little rivers and things like that. There's a good story from along the East Coast. Sort of a rich businessman decided that he wanted to have emus on his little personal island, so he bought a few emus thinking this would be great, I'll have them just wander around my little island, but didn't realize they swam, and
they swam away.
They swam back to the mainland, and now there's this introduced population of emus on this little coastal town in New South Wales.
I love it. Sorry, but it sounds funny, doesn't it? Yeah, so here are two enjoying their showers on the hot summer day. Nothing better.
I will sign off then, ladies.
All right. Well, thank you again. And
thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks,
have a great day, everyone.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.